I always like to start each episode with our listeners learning more about my guests. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us more about your background and what got you interested in wanting to write a book like this.
Sure. By training, originally, I was a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and I worked for many years in that field and then transitioned into becoming an executive coach. But one of my specialties as a psychologist was doing work with couples. And so you can imagine how much work in the workplace reminds you of work you do with couples. So, from my background, that became a big part of my work as an executive coach, helping people with conflict, teams, leaders, when you have two people on your team who don't get along, but you need both of them desperately, like they need to be part of the team, but they don't get along. So, that's become a big part of my work. And I decided to write this book because so many teams that I work with, I'm asked to help solve this like difficult problem of bad dynamics on the team. The culture's bad. And what I found to be helpful is to give people something to read beforehand that says, if everyone on the team reads this and really understands how dynamics work on teams, when we get together for that offsite, we're going to make a lot more progress. So that was the impetus for writing this book.
I love the format of the book. It's really the visual method. Not a whole lot of text, but text that really drives home application and impact and really de escalates conflict, engages responsibility, and can achieve some real solutions to change the workplace culture and to build stronger team dynamics. So I love the approach. Just curious, why did you choose that approach for this book? We kind of talked about this prior to starting the interview.
Well, so I decided to make it illustrated because I find that conflict is a hard enough topic. And when you present it in a way, when you talk about some of these difficult issues with drawings that demonstrate, how can you look at this differently? We often talk about, get to the balcony and look at a problem from above it. And I found in my work with couples, and my couples book is also this way, when you show people this is what is happening, then all parties can look at it on a piece of paper and say, yes, that is actually what's happening. That's the dynamic. That's happening. And it makes it more possible to resolve it. I think it's hard, frankly, to keep all these details in your head. I'm getting triggered about this particular part of the conversation we're having. The conflict is making me not think straight, and therefore I can't keep track about what was the thing you said about how to handle this person. I can't remember it. So sometimes having a picture of it can be very useful. So that was the idea behind making it illustrated.
Well, a picture's worth a thousand words, so you're able to convey a whole lot more with those pictures sometimes than trying to explain it through just words on a page. Let's start with unpacking some of these big ideas with I love how you started in saying that there's these under and over the table dynamics or above the table strategies, but under the table dynamics. Explain the difference between these two and how it really affects teams.
Sure. Well, anyone who's worked in any working setting knows that there's the work that's happening in the conversation that's happening at work. There's the work that's happening. And then there's also all the conversation that's not being said that's happening. I call it under the table. So you're in a meeting and we're talking about strategy for next year. But what's also happening is that someone's giving someone else the evil eye, and one person is interrupting someone intentionally because they don't like the person who just spoke. And so I call all of that the under the table conversation. And the reason I sort it that way into the above the table work and the under the table dynamics is that a lot of times we actually try to solve the under the table dynamics with over the table strategies. So, for example, a lot of times we get some dynamics under the table because the roles and responsibilities aren't clear between different team members. And if we say, let's just get together and sort out the roles and responsibilities, that's a terrific idea. It's an above the table strategy. Sometimes it works. If it sorts it out and then all the junk that happened between people because there was overlapping responsibilities goes away, then fabulous. But a lot of the times that stuff doesn't solve it. It makes everyone at the meeting will say, "I agree. That makes perfect sense. Let's do that." And then they go back and they still are experiencing and feeling the under the table stuff, so they don't quite let it go. And so my point in the book is that a lot of times we don't know how to deal with that under the table stuff, but if we don't deal with it in an under the table way, we'll never solve it.
When you have two questions, which I think are great to unpack what's happening under the table. And if you just focus on these, right, it's going to get you started down the right path. And that's one, what threats are people responding to? And what kind of armor are people putting on in response to those threats, which we're going to unpack here shortly. But first, let's tackle that first one regarding threats. If you can just give us more insight in that first question.
Absolutely. I mean, threats is a strong word. Okay. So sometimes people say threats, no one's shooting me, no one's attacking me. But there are social threats that we respond to all the time. And most of the time, the under the table dynamics are caused because someone said something to me that I experienced as a threat. And I then said something to you that you experienced as a threat. And then as a result, we're holding resentments, we're behaving differently, we're changing our interaction because something hurt. And we don't like to talk about hurt at work. It's kind of like, what? We're all professionals here, we're all adults. Why are we talking about hurt? But in fact, we do get hurt and we get triggered, and it's often very automatic without any control that we can like immediately place. You said something, I felt a little embarrassed in the meeting because of what you said, and now I'm annoyed with you. Now I'm going to be a little more standoffish. And that's what begins the dynamic. So, in order to unpack the stuff that's under the table, I often say to leaders, do you have any idea what threats your people are experiencing that is causing some of this less than perfect behavior?
Can you list some of the most common ones in your book, like success, and it's thwarted or limited achievement when that's a threat, or when you don't feel like you're able to fully achieve something that you want, or when there's unfairness, right? You've been treated unfairly, unfair loss to others. So you identify some more common threats that a lot of people experience. And what I love when in the book, when you say it, is that at the core, people are reasonable, friendly, hardworking, have every intention on doing a good job at work. Their core selves are what you want for them to represent at work. But for whatever reason, when they experience these threats, right, especially in the environment, that's when we turn to placing on certain types of armor.
Exactly. So, yes, people are good at heart. People want to do a good job. I mean, yes, there's probably a few outliers who aren't in that category, but I would say when you show up to a new job, you want to do a good job, you want to be successful, you want to prove yourself to have been a good hire, all of those things. And exactly as you're saying, we will indeed stay that way, but for threats that come and get us. So if I show up at my new job and right away someone says, "Oh, wait, you weren't the one we were. Are you the one we hired first? Are you the one? Wait," and then I interpret that as, "Wait a second, I have just my value has just been doubted. They didn't want to hire me, and now they. So now I feel a little uncertain, less confident." And I want to now I feel a little bit more pressure to prove myself. I've just been questioned. And then what does that proving myself need start to bring out in me? Am I going to start boasting a little bit more? Am I going to start, you know, more forcefully declaring my worth? We're all going to respond in some way. And I think of it as like armor is so universal. Everybody gets defensive. We don't There's not just one defensive guy over there. We all have our ways when we're threatened, especially around things like our ability to achieve and be successful on the job. You want to be successful. If someone's thwarting your ability to be successful, you're going to do something to try to overcome that threat. And sometimes that looks like an armor that might be a little less appealing than yourself at your core.
But you feel justified by putting it on the inside because you want to self protect, but it irritates others externally when they see it on you. And you have the nice, I mean, I love this metaphor. And you almost say it's like your armor self is a little like your evil twin, right? It's what you are on your worst day when you feel those threats barraging you and you just get defensive and you put on the armor and not be your core self.
Exactly. I mean, we're all very familiar with this at home. In our relationships at home, there's me as my best self and me as my less great self. Let's say in your role as a parent or your role as a partner. If I were to ask you, think about what your least best self is. When you're not, when you're just feeling kind of at your worst, what you might call your evil twin. If your evil twin is almost always triggered by threat. Your evil twin isn't going to come out just randomly. It comes out because you feel that need to protect yourself. As you said, it's justified to protect yourself, but then it looks on the outside less good. So, for example, if I don't know, take the home example. If I am so frustrated at the end of my day that all I want to do is watch TV and block everything out, totally reasonable. But how might my partner read that behavior? It might look like you're ignoring me. And the same thing happens at work. If you're head down, for example, there's a lot of drama going on in the team, and you say to yourself, I'm going to be the only person here who's just not causing drama. So I'm going to put my head down, I'm going to do my work, and I'm just going to ignore all these people because that's the professional thing to do. And I think that's totally great behavior, but it's also armor. And to other people who feel very invested in whatever the important dramatic thing that's going on is, you shutting down and locking yourself in a room and doing your work in a room starts to feel like, I mean, you'll hear people's reactions. They'll say things like, well, who does he think he is? He thinks he's better than us. He's always acting like what we're talking about is of no concern to him. So it's a funny thing how armor tends to look, even though from the inside totally justified, tends to look so awful to other people. And they're often subtle ways that then unintentionally threaten other people. And then they put their armor on.
So that's a great insight, and that's a great pausing to really reflect on that, on your perception of, how you're viewed by others might be different than what you think your intent is by putting on that armor. And I love what you say too, because everyone, when they look at toxic work culture or bad team dynamics, they look for bad apples. And there's that bad apple fallacy, right? And really, bad apples aren't really bad apples. They're really good apples, right? Just trying to protect themselves.
Exactly. So I often think, when you ask a leader, how's your team? They'll say, I have a great group, but there's a couple of bad apples. And then you ask them, what are the bad apples like? And then they describe certain behaviors that these so called bad apples do, like that one doesn't delegate well, and that one is a little too isolated and it doesn't communicate, or that one's a little too boastful. And when I ask, why do you suppose they're like that? I always want to get under, okay, bad apples are not bad apples through and through. Like they were born bad apples and then they showed up at your job and you interviewed them and they were a bad apple and you decided, let me hire this bad apple. Like that would not have happened. So clearly you hired a decent apple and something has happened that has caused them to start to shrivel up into a bad one. And I'll ask a leader, what do you think that could have been? And I mean, there's so many stories. I'll tell you one where it was a mortgage company where, people had to originate deals, and this one particular worker was not doing them fast enough. So the boss decided, I don't know, I think he's not making enough cold calls. I'm going to need to just kind of watch him. So she started to monitor this one broker's calls and then realized, he's making a bunch of calls but not being that effective, and I think I got to listen in a little bit more on his patter of what he says on the cold calls. So she actually moved his desk just outside her office and still was unsatisfied, and finally moved his desk into her office, almost to make a point to say, I'm going to watch you and make sure I can adjust everything you say to make sure you're more successful. This is one of the most extreme examples I ever heard. And I said, what happened to his performance over time when he was in his own office, when he was outside your office, when he was in your office? And she said, it's so crazy. It got worse. And I said, that does not surprise me in the slightest, because the more you monitor, the more you criticize, the more you micromanage, that's just becomes an overload of threat. And you just keep getting more of his armored behavior, which in this case was avoiding, doing fewer calls, getting demoralized, and so on. So, sometimes it's not always expected the interventions that we try against these bad apples because we're missing the point that their bad appleness is armor and it's not their true selves. And we can do other things in order to bring out their good apple selves.
That's a great perspective shift to take, that if real change in team dynamics is what we're after, we're much better looking at problematic interactions between armored good people than looking for bad apples or unprofessional personalities. It's just not a very effective approach. You give different types of bad apples. I'd like to just go through one just to further illustrate this for our listeners. And the one that I like to go through is the chaos clearer. And I'll give you just kind of the background that you mentioned in the book is that they see so many things that don't run as they should, such as processes that are outdated, coworkers that are slow, mistakes slip by and cause costly inefficiencies. Every day is agitating and frustratingly unproductive, especially since they care about getting results. Their armor is the fight type, which maybe you can clarify between the flight and fight type of armor, where they take action against the threats of success around them. They take charge of improving processes, push for quicker problem solving, give feedback to others about mistakes and ways to improve. Now, that's coming from a good intent, but from their team, that's not perceived that way, correct?
That's right. That's right. And actually, when I talk about this case, I often show the picture of the chaos clear. I'm going to just show it. Okay, this is what it feels like to be kind of just surrounded by like a conveyor belt of stuff coming at you and trying to manage it. And most people can relate to that. There's so many times at work when you feel overwhelmed. And the most obvious thing to do when you're feeling overwhelmed and so many things aren't going right and you just feel like you're juggling, you just want to take some control and make it work better. And so it's so normal to just say, okay, how can I control things better? How can I monitor what's going on around me better? Take more control of what the team is doing, check up on people more, maybe give them more feedback. And those actions, again, totally reasonable, but come across to people as micromanaging, not trusting, and and that in itself launches this other threat. Now, I would say the intention there is so pure. The intention is pure. The impact is terrible. And that's the thing that we often have to contend with when we do some self-examination of ourselves as leaders. The things I'm doing are reasonable and well-intended, but I really have to pay attention to how they impact. And what am I seeing that's changing over time because of my interventions?
And that's a critical distinction. And we'll get more into that because without that self awareness, it's lots of problems can ensue. And the other thing that I really love about your approach too is that everyone contributes to team dynamics. Even the good apples contribute to it as well. And you kind of mentioned this before, kind of the deep focuser, right? That just wants to get focused on their work, kind of just be away from everyone else. They don't want the micromanaging, the finger pointing, the boasting colleagues in their environment. So they armor up, tune everyone out, and become the lone wolf. But even with good intentions and being a good apple, if we stick to that analogy, it's then they could still be perceived the wrong way by their coworkers.
Correct. I mean, if you think about it, so I'll just give you an example of a team that I've worked with where when you come and talk to every member of the team, everyone will say there's two people that are really problematic or three people or whatever. They'll identify and they'll say there's that one and there's that one. And the behaviors of those typically are more, I would say they're more fight related. Because I think when we put armor on, it's either fight or flight. You're either going to do something that's going towards the problem, like the chaos clear is taking action, trying to deal with the chaos by organizing things and ordering things and giving people directives. Whereas people who take more of a flight approach are going to withdraw or have less interaction or do something that's a bit more or shut down emotionally as a way to cope with what's around them. So, well, again, both types of armor reasonable, but both types have impact. So when I go and see a team, there are two loud folks, let's say, who everyone can point to and say, yeah, that one's always challenging the leader. And that one is always like on some kind of, you know, mission, for something that's really important. We need more of this in our department. And it's like too much already. Right. So they'll all notice those two. And then when I talk to each member of the team, I'll ask, so how do you react to those others? And some people will say, I just ignore them. What's the impact of ignoring them? Because that also has impact. Or, you know what? I try to just calm people down. I talk to people afterwards and try to calm people down. Oh, so you're like the back channel person that people talk to instead of taking it to the leader? What's the impact of that? Well, I guess suppose it undermines the leader a little bit, but not really. I'm just doing it out of the goodness of my heart, trying to help people. So what you start to notice is the strategies that people take, even if they themselves see it's not, it doesn't seem obviously bad apple. It actually seems quite helpful. Like they're trying to help certain things. Still, there are ways in which that too has impact. I mean, the one I see so often is someone who kind of elects themselves as like the union representative in a way of the team, where I'm the one who always goes to the leader to tell what everyone on the team is thinking. So they'll go to the leader and they'll say, people are saying that your approach to this and that isn't great. And then the leader's like, who's saying that? I can't really say. I can't say who's saying it, but people are saying, and you ought to. And so that person thinks of themselves as very helpful. They don't think of themselves as causing any sort of problem, but in a lot of ways, they are often the one who feels most undermining to the leader, who prevents other people from speaking directly because they're so willing to take on the fight. And that does contribute to the dynamics of the team. So when I say everyone contributes, it helps for everyone to own what their part of it was so that everyone can own their part.
That is critical. And the other piece that I really have enjoyed is that armoring is a state, not a personality trait. I hear this a lot from leaders where they almost assassinate someone's character. So the fundamental mindset shift, right, is needed to help people change non-optimal behavior. They're good people within. They're doing something that's not productive, not optimal. So we need to think of bad behavior as coming from a person's traits or triggered by a person's state. And that distinction is critical as well, so that they become less defensive and you help encourage the situation to get on better footing.
Absolutely. If you think about it, when we give feedback that's of the type that suggests that there's something wrong with your personality. So, for example, if a leader says, you have some anger issues, that sounds like my person has anger issues. If I say, you tend to be a little disorganized, you tend to be a little aloof, you are the kind of person who doesn't return emails, all of that starts to sound like much more of a personal attack. And I don't want to hear that feedback. People don't want to hear feedback like that. So they're more likely to reject it. But if you say, and this goes beyond just identifying observable behavior to give feedback about, this goes to how do you interpret the observable behavior? If I say, I'm noticing you haven't been returning emails to this particular person, and I'm wondering if there's something that's happening that's causing that dynamic to happen, because that's unusual for you. Now, what I've done is I've separated their armored self from their regular self. Regular self returns emails. This strange state you're in right now is not an email returner. What is that about? And so separating people from, like, kind of peeling off the armor and assuming it's armor, and you say to the person, something must be getting under your skin because you're kind of a little bit flying off the handle more than typical. I'm not saying you have an anger management problem. I'm saying recently something must be getting under your skin that's causing you to burst out a bit more. And then the person is so much more likely to say, thank you for noticing that. It's true. This is what's getting under my skin. This is the threat that I'm struggling with. And, you're right. I have been a little testier than usual. So people are much more likely to accept the feedback if you speak about it as if it's this momentary, state that they're in that is different from their usual self, their usual traits. And so that's why I think it's such a helpful tool.
And it's transformational. I mean, it's so simple to use, but if people could get better at giving that kind of feedback, relationships would be transformed just I think on that alone, personal and professional and everywhere else. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, just that shift in mindset. It's common sense, but common sense isn't common practice, and it's yeah, I've seen it work brilliantly, and it does work. People just have to be more aware and try to employ it more, because if they don't, then that defensiveness kicks in, and then you enter into these cycles, these charge and dodge cycles, or cycles where the armor is both a response to a threat and a cause to a threat. And this cycle of negativity is spiraling downward, wreaking havoc on the relationship, the culture of the team, and perhaps the organization.
Yes. I mean, this is one of the most important points that I want to get across, which is every time you sense that somebody else is a bad apple, you might want to ask yourself, is there a cycle going on between us? Now, this is something I've learned from couples therapy, from being doing couples therapy for many, many years, right? We can always easily identify the problem in our partner's behavior, but almost always the partner can identify the problem in our behavior that's causing the problem that we're mentioning in theirs. And it's the same at work. The idea is that we are our evil twin behavior tends to be circular. So I if I do something to protect myself, you're going to feel it, and then it's going to inadvertently threaten you, and you're going to feel it, and then you're going to react, and then I'm going to feel your reaction and react again. So here's the most important point. Conflict is almost always circular. So you see a negative behavior, you see a bad apple, you got to ask yourself, what am I contributing? Is there anything that I mean, I always push leaders to do this. You have someone on your team, they are the one bad apple. How do you typically interact with that person? And the leader will say, well, I only interact with them because they're so slow. I only push them because they're so slow. And I say, okay, I don't, you know how you would say to kids, I don't care who started it? Was it his slowness or your pushing that started it? But all I know is that pushing and slowness go together. If somebody's slow, someone else is pushing. If someone's pushing, someone else is slow. So, these are often very predictable pairs that you see. Sometimes if you can help a leader to see the particular type of bad appleness, and I say, why would someone do that? Why would someone, for example, why would someone boast loudly in meetings? Why do people do that? It's a strange behavior, right? Why do people talk over others deliberately in a meeting? Like, there's got to be some reason. And often it's like the person is saying the leader undervalues me. And I've got to like show him or her that I am good. And then I turn to the leader and I say, how often do you give that person positive feedback? Well, never, because he's always boasting. Okay, well, maybe that's what he's needing, is to just hear a little bit more of a message from you that he's doing great. And then he doesn't have to keep talking about how great he's doing. So they always come in pairs. Things tend to be circular. And that I think is not a widely enough known fact about interaction. But I'm intending to put that out as much as possible in the world that this is happening at work all the time. Interactions are circular. So take a look at ourselves to help solve some of these dimensional problems.
I would agree. It's not known very well. And if you can just take that perspective, just pause, reflect, how are you contributing to it, would be immensely helpful for any relationship you have. Because what you really want to get people to do is, if you want to change the dynamics with any relationship, whether it's professional, personal, then everyone needs to own their own armor. And the most common way that I at first thought before I read your book was tell them, right? Tell that other person, give them feedback about it, but that is not the right approach. What would you recommend instead, Michelle?
In a sense, that's asking someone else to own their armor. And I right? It's saying, "Here's what you're doing wrong, and here's what I'd like you to own. Could you please own this?" And as you know, in personal relationships, this is the same. When I own mine first, it's much more likely that the other person's gonna own it. So if I say, I really lost it in that meeting. I mean, I lost it. I was trying to I was pushing I was nervous about what's happening for us this quarter, and I came down hard on you guys, and I really it was too much. And I wanna draw that back because things have been moving slowly, and it's just been really hard on me. Okay? A leader says that. How much more likely is it for the team to say, "We know. We get it. It's all right. We're also under a lot of pressure. We're feeling it with you. Don't worry. You're not alone in this," right? There's this but when it becomes something that's, "I'm blaming you for this lack of success," then it gets much more heated. But if I can own it and say, I know what I contributed," and a lot of this comes from, you know, I have to say this as a psychologist because it comes from our life stories, right? So our families of origin, it comes from all the other jobs we've ever been in, it comes from all the other interactions we've ever been in. If my boss reminds me of my older brother who was very, pushy and not kind, I don't actually have an older brother, but if my boss reminds me of my older brother, then I'm gonna feel an extra bit of pressure if he starts operating with older brother behavior. So it's gonna feel a little more fired up for me than it might for someone else. And that's another piece that if you know that about yourself, you have so much more control over your own emotional reactions. Because someone who hasn't ever thought about that, the fact that their older brother still haunts their current workplace, they're much more likely to just say like, "That guy, I don't know what's wrong with him. He's horrible." But a person who has insight into their own life story will say, "I know why this guy is triggering me so much. Totally reminds me of my brother." And therefore, I'm responding a little more strongly to him than I would to someone else. I can get that under control. I can own my armor. I don't have to start saying, "You remind me of my brother." I can just say, "I'm a little bit I got a little triggered by what had just happened," or I'm just a little sensitive to that kind of stuff. So, um, that can open up the dialogue too, is owning not just the armor that you put on, but sometimes your overreactions. And I wanna just say, the word overreaction sounds like a terrible word, but we all overreact. It's not like just some people overreact. We all overreact when something has extra meaning for us. And we put on stronger armor when something has extra meaning, and we're less likely to be reasonable. We're much more in our evil twin when something has that very specific trigger that we know from, earlier in life, either from our families or from a previous work situation that we were in. And so the more you know about yourself and the more you're both about what triggers you, what kind of armor you put on, and also the impact of your armor, typically, it can help you catch it much more quickly with people.
You mentioned leaders, they need to go first, that because they have an outsized impact on their teams. Talk to me a little bit about those three parts of owning your armor for our listeners so they can really fully digest that and start that reflective process.
Yeah, so in the book I have questionnaires where people can actually get some assistance in thinking about what are the threats that I'm up against? What's my armor look like? So there's three pieces to it, to owning your armor. The first is own the threats that you're being exposed to. So think about it. What is it that's happening for you in the workplace that feels hard for you? I have this competitive colleague. I have a boss who I feel like is incompetent and it's frustrating me. Whatever it is, own the difficulties that are happening for you that are having some kind of emotional reaction in yourself. That's owning your threats. Owning your armor is you ask yourself the question, how am I reacting to that threat? So I have this boss I think is incompetent. What am I doing in response to that? And can I look very closely at what that behavior that I'm doing is and consider what's the impact of it? So if what I find myself doing with my incompetent boss is correcting him or her all the time, "You did mean this, right? Not that. And don't you think we should do it this way?" I can say, "Totally reasonable behavior. My armor's reasonable. I'm just trying to help him or her. Help." Right? Totally reasonable. but I got to ask myself, all my correcting from below, what's the impact? So, three things: own your threats, own your armor, and really own your impact. If I can think about what impact I'm having with my not so intentional armor, I can offer that to a team, to my I could go to my boss and say, "I think we're stuck in a bit of a cycle here with each other, and I can recognize that I think you might experience me as not as helpful as I'm trying to be. Can we talk about it?" If I own my side and invite someone into a conversation to and say, "Is there anything that you see happening? What does it look like from your end?" You have the possibility to have that vulnerable conversation. And people always talk about, I need to have a crucial conversation or, a difficult conversation. What does that actually entail? It means getting into a much more vulnerable human spot with another person and saying, "Here's what's happening under the table for us, and I want to change it. Can you join me in changing it?" And when you do that, when you approach a conversation with owning your stuff first, it's much more powerful. And to get back to the other point that you mentioned about leaders going first, it is almost never the case that I would ask someone from below to start that conversation, even though that example I gave just was. Because think how hard that is to do when you're not the authority. But if you're the leader and you notice a dynamic that's happening with you in one of your reports or with you and one of your peers, and you can say, "I want to have a dialogue. Something's not going right." It's incredibly powerful and can really change things. And especially if it's for an entire team. I'll always say the leader has to go first. The leader has to own their armor first, say what their contribution has been first, and hear from the team, what has my impact actually been? I'm ready to hear it because I want to change it.
So that's definitely being vulnerable. That's showing authenticity, but that's what great leaders do. And from that own your own armor reflection, you go into these conversations, which you alluded to. Said so much of our armor is what causes bad team dynamics. And the key to changing culture is to remove the armor, return to interacting in a way that's true of our core selves. You mentioned now that's difficult to do. I mean, let's just look at a corporate environment for a moment, because no one knows how to go first, or should a certain person go first and they become vulnerable. And if someone else doesn't reciprocate that same level of vulnerability, then it further damages the trust of that relationship. So you even say there's a certain type of offsite that might be beneficial for teams to do or corporations to do to build the right culture of trust and make sure that the team dynamics are stronger.
Yes. I mean, if you think about it, if on your team you now have a bit of a culture of mistrust, you can't just do like a team building exercise and we'll go back to trust. It needs something more powerful. And I think you're right. It's not so easy to do this. Like most leaders will say, I can't do that. I don't know what it is that we have to do. And so I'll say, look, you probably need a coach to help you. You need an external person who can support the team and do this because you also want the leader to be part of the owning. And, most leaders are great at their jobs for what they what they do. They're not also great at unearthing team dynamics and figuring that out. So oftentimes you do need a coach to help you. But I think you can start that process even before you bring a coach in to say, I would like to understand the threats that are hitting my team. Can we talk about that? Like, that's a very interesting and very powerful conversation too, and it's a good way for a leader to start it, is to say, I just read this book, Own Your Armor. I feel like I wanna understand if we're experiencing some of our culture stuff because of different threats and armor reactions, and I kinda wanna ask people, what threats do they see? And when a leader opens that and people can say, I think our competitor has upped the ante for us. And so for the last quarter, we've just been falling apart. Or this merger has changed everything. And I feel like I have to compete for my job. And that's a threat. Or this new performance management system is scary. And, you're making us do something different than we did before, and I'm going to lose half my people, and that's a threat. Any one of those, if you open a dialogue about that, you can ask what's threatening people and what can we try to do to minimize some of the threat so that we can be less armored together. So that in itself is a good conversation, but it is very so yes, it's different than a regular offsite. It sometimes needs expert facilitation, and it can be started by everyone just beginning their own self-assessment and at least a group assessment of what the threats are for the whole system.
Excellent point, and I would agree. It's really difficult with some leaders, especially new leaders or leaders that don't have this experience, to really have those conversations and do the work without transitioning it into a third party and doing it as an offsite. And all of this really speaks to personal, professional dynamics. I know we've talked a lot about the workplace, but owning your armor unlocks team strengths, it unlocks relationship strengths. And I love how you kind of concluded the book is by saying that, remember, owning your armor doesn't require changing everyone's personality. Instead, when team members return to operating from their core selves, everyone's strengths are fully unlocked for the benefit of the enterprise. You could say this for a personal relationship as well. When everyone is unarmored, every team member's strengths are more appreciated, and it makes the overall team, whatever that team comprises of, personal or professional, more productive and better.
Yeah. I often think of it as, when the team starts to go down the spiral of armor, it's like everyone goes down, but you can actually start to shift it to go back up. And one person's more core behavior brings out somebody else's more core behavior. And it's almost like I often think, that board game Othello where there's like chips that are either on the white side or the black side, and it looks like one person's winning the whole time, and then one chip flips and the whole board starts to shift over to the other color. And I think it's a little like that on teams where it looks like a mess. But if you start to open up some of this dialogue, the culture really can shift rather quickly because everybody wants to get out of their armored selves. Nobody wants to be there. And if people can start to return to their core selves, it starts to feel like, who are these people? Where'd they come from? They were in there all the time, but when the threats are high, everyone has to keep their armor on. And if you set the conditions so that people don't have to keep their armor on because you give them an opportunity to talk about why they've gotten armored up, you can open up an avenue for things to change rather rapidly. And you're absolutely right. It's the same as in personal relationships. I've worked with many couples where for years they're stuck in their armor. And then you begin to say, this isn't your real selves. This isn't your real selves. We know who your real selves are because that's who you were when you met many, many years ago. Your real selves were much more flexible, much more loving, much more open. And now everyone's gotten like rigid and specific about how things have to be done. And it's like, hold on, the real person's still in there. Your friends get to see the real person. And if you take one person who's working in a bad team and you move them to a different job, and suddenly they're like the most high performer there, but they were, a bad apple in the previous company, what caused that to happen? They were armored in one company, they're unarmored in the other, and you get the best out of them. So when you can actually help people get back to their regular selves, you release all these strengths in the individuals and in the entire team as a whole. It's a beautiful thing to see.
It is. It's like a virtuous cycle where everyone's being elevated through taking off that armor instead of this negative spiral downward where you just keep armoring up and just not the best case scenario for a team, for a relationship, for anything. Thank you, Michelle, for joining me today. Really appreciated all our conversations, some great insights that I know listeners are going to really appreciate. Remind everyone how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Okay, well, they can find me on LinkedIn, Michelle Brody, and my book is available, wherever books are sold on your armor. And there's another book also that's about couples. So if you're interested in the personal side, it's called Stop the Fight. Is my book about couples, also illustrated. And so appreciate you for this time, Charles, and it was so nice to talk to you.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.